The war had changed everything. For centuries, the Velithian Empire had ruled vast regions of space, their discipline and advanced technology making them nearly unstoppable. But then came the Gorvok swarm, a monstrous species that consumed everything in its path. Even the mighty Velithians struggled against them. In desperation, they did something unthinkable. They allied with humans. Princess Silara had been sent as a diplomatic observer to Fort Vanguard, a joint military base where humans and Velithians trained together. As the heir to the Velithian throne, she had been taught to control her emotions, to be a leader of logic and discipline. She had never doubted her own strength until she met Captain Daniel Carter. The first time she saw him, something inside her shifted. He was different from the Velithians she had grown up with. His posture was relaxed yet confident, his movements casual but powerful. While Velithian warriors stood stiff and formal, this human walked with an easy arrogance, as if war was nothing more than a game to him. It should have irritated her, but instead, she found herself staring for a moment too long. Silara quickly looked away, tightening her jaw. This is foolish. She was here for the mission, not distractions. Daniel approached her with a grin. So, you're the princess, huh? Expected you to be taller. Silara blinked. What kind of greeting was that? She straightened, keeping her face neutral. Height has little to do with capability, Captain Carter. Fair enough. He chuckled, completely unbothered by her cold tone. Guess we'll see how capable you are in training. Before she could respond, the warning sirens blared across the base, an emergency combat drill. Soldiers rushed into formation, preparing for a simulated attack. Daniel turned to her. Hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty, princess. She lifted her chin. Lead the way, Captain. The battlefield was chaos. Explosions shook the ground, simulated laser fire streaked through the air, and soldiers moved in perfect formation. Silara had fought in real battles before, but this was the first time she had seen humans in action. She had expected them to be reckless. That was what Velithian scholars had always said. Humans were wild, undisciplined creatures who relied too much on instinct. But as she watched Daniel move across the battlefield, barking orders and adapting in real time, she realized something. Humans were not reckless. They were unpredictable. Daniel didn't follow a rigid battle plan like the Velithians. Instead, he adjusted on the fly, changing tactics in ways that would have been unthinkable for her people. And yet it worked. Silara barely had time to react before a training droid lunged at her. She spun, striking with practiced precision, disabling it with a swift blow. But then, another enemy appeared at her flank. Too late to react. A blur of motion. Daniel tackled her out of the way, firing his weapon and taking down the enemy. They landed hard, his body half covering hers. For a brief second, Silara felt something strange. She was a princess, a warrior, a commander, and yet, at that moment, she was simply a person, caught off guard by the closeness of this human. His breath was warm against her cheek, his eyes sharp with focus. You all right, princess? His voice was lower now, almost teasing. Silara shoved him off. I had the situation under control. Daniel laughed as he got to his feet. Yeah, sure you did. She glared at him, heart pounding for reasons she refused to acknowledge. After the drill, Silara sat alone in her quarters, deep in thought. She had always believed that humans were lesser beings, too emotional, too chaotic. But today, she had seen something different. Daniel Carter was not just a soldier. He was dangerous in ways she did not understand. Not because he was stronger than her, not because he was reckless. Not always, Daniel said. Sometimes, instinct is what keeps you alive. He moved fast, too fast. Before she could react, he was behind her, tapping her shoulder. She spun, swinging a punch, but he dodged easily. See, he said, grinning. You think before you move. That's good for a commander, but bad for a fighter in close combat. Silara clenched her jaw. Then teach me. Hours passed. Daniel pushed her harder than she had expected. He made her react, not think. He used feints, sudden attacks, anything to force her out of her usual combat patterns. At first, she struggled. But then, something changed. She stopped trying to control the fight and let go. She felt the flow of battle, reacting without hesitation. When Daniel struck, she dodged before she even thought about it. When he moved to counter, she was already in position to block. For the first time, she understood what he meant by instinct. After an intense session, they both stood, panting. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead. Not bad. Princess, you're learning. Silara was too exhausted to argue. She simply nodded. Daniel grinned. Same time tomorrow. She hesitated. Why was she looking forward to this? Yes, she said. As she left the training hall, she realized something troubling. She wasn't just learning from him. She was starting to enjoy his presence. Silara stood in front of the mirror in her private quarters, staring at her reflection. Her muscles ached from the intense training, but she ignored the pain. The real battle was happening inside her. Why was she enjoying the training with Daniel so much? She told herself it was because she was improving. That was the logical answer. And yet, every time she saw him, something shifted inside her, something unfamiliar. Her mind was sharp, her body was strong, but her emotions, they were becoming difficult to control. She clenched her fists. This is weakness. A warrior should not feel this way. And yet, when the time came for training, she found herself walking to the human sector without hesitation. Daniel was already waiting for her. The training hall was empty, the morning light streaming in from the high windows. He stood in the center, stretching as he always did. When he saw her, he grinned. "You're early, princess," he said. "So are you," she replied. He chuckled. "Guess that means we're both serious about this." She nodded. "Let's begin." The training was even more intense than before. Daniel wasn't going easy on her. Every time she thought she had caught up, he would push her further. Faster movements, unpredictable attacks. She had to react without thinking, relying only on the instincts he was trying to teach her. For hours, they fought. Silara dodged, countered, and struck back with everything she had. But Daniel was still one step ahead. Then, finally, she landed a hit. Her fist struck his side, knocking him back slightly. He laughed, holding his ribs. "Now that was a good punch," he said. "You're getting there, princess." Silara exhaled heavily, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You still held back." Daniel smirked. "Maybe a little. Can't have you breaking my ribs, can I?" She narrowed her eyes. "Do not insult me with your mercy." His expression softened. "It's not about mercy. It's about learning. You're improving fast, Silara. But skill isn't just about power. It's also about knowing when not to strike." Silara stared at him. His words carried a meaning beyond combat. She had always fought with intensity, with strategy. But Daniel fought with understanding, not just of battle, but of people. And that was what unsettled her the most. Because when she looked at him, she felt like he could see through her. Later that evening, Silara walked alone through the corridors of the base. She looked at the dummy again, replaying her last move. He was right. She had made a mistake. That had never happened before. Daniel stepped forward. "Something's on your mind." She ignored him, attacking the dummy again. "Is it about what I said last night?" He continued. Her grip tightened around her weapon. "You assume too much, human." He chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe I just know you better than you think." Silara turned to face him. "You know nothing about me." Daniel's gaze was steady. "I know you fight like you have something to prove. I know you push yourself harder than anyone else. And I know you're afraid to ask yourself what you really want. Because you don't know the answer." Silara's breath caught. For a moment, she said nothing. Because he was right. And that terrified her. Silence stretched between them. Silara turned away, gripping her weapon tightly. "I was raised to be strong," she said finally. "To lead, to fight for my people." Daniel nodded. "And you do. But what about when the war is over?" Silara frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens after all this?" He gestured around them. "When the battles stop, when there's no more enemy to fight, then what?" Silara had never thought about that. She had never needed to. Her life had always been about duty, honor, and strength. There was no future beyond war, or at least she had never considered one. Daniel sighed. "You don't have to answer now, but someday you'll have to face that question." Silara stared at him. Why did he make things so complicated? Before she could respond, an alarm blared through the training hall. "Emergency alert. All personnel to battle stations." Silara's instincts took over. Whatever personal conflict, she had disappeared. There was no time for hesitation. She grabbed her communicator. "Report." A voice crackled through. "Unknown vessel approaching." No response to hails. Silara and Daniel exchanged a look. This was no drill. The command center was a blur of movement. Officers shouted reports. Screens flashed red warnings. Silara and Daniel arrived quickly. "What's the situation?" Silara asked, her voice steady. A soldier turned to her. "The ship is of unknown origin. They have not responded to our calls. They are heavily armed." Silara narrowed her eyes. This wasn't a mistake. It was a threat. "Prepare the defense systems," she ordered. Daniel stepped beside her. "You think they're here for a fight?" Silara's jaw tightened. "I know they are." The screen flickered. Suddenly, a voice cut through the static. "Silara, daughter of the High King, surrender yourself, or we will open fire." A cold chill ran down her spine. Daniel's expression darkened. "They're here for you." Silara didn't move, didn't blink. Her past had finally caught up with her. And now, she would have to face it. A heavy silence filled the command center. Everyone stared at the screen where the threatening message had come through. "Silara, daughter of the High King, surrender yourself, or we will open fire." Silara's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She knew this was coming. Her enemies had finally found her. Beside her, Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "They think you'll just give up, after everything." Silara's gaze stayed on the screen. "They do not know me." The enemy vessel hovered outside, its weapons locked onto the station. Silara could feel the tension in the room. Soldiers waited for her order. The choice was hers. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. No fear, no hesitation. "Open a channel," she commanded. But because, for the first time in her life, she had met someone who made her question everything she had been taught. And that was far more dangerous than any battle. Princess Silara sat at the edge of her bunk, staring at the dim glow of the command console. The events of the training exercise replayed in her mind. The way Captain Daniel Carter moved, the way he fought, the way he had tackled her out of danger. Her heart tightened at the memory. Unacceptable. She was a Velethian princess, trained to master her emotions. No human, no matter how skilled, should affect her like this. She clenched her fists. There was only one way to regain control. She needed to prove, to herself and to him, that she was his equal. The next morning, the training grounds were alive with activity. Humans and Velethians sparred side by side, practicing combat techniques. Silara walked in with her usual grace, her golden armor reflecting the artificial sunlight of the military base. Soldiers turned to look, but she ignored them. She was searching for only one person, and there he was, Daniel Carter, standing by the armory, checking his weapon. Silara approached him with purpose. "Captain Carter." Daniel turned and smirked. "Princess, what can I do for you?" "A duel." Her voice was firm. "You and me. Hand-to-hand combat." A few nearby soldiers paused to listen. Humans loved competition, and the idea of a Velithian princess challenging their captain had caught their interest. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Celara crossed her arms. "Are you afraid?" His smirk widened. "All right, princess. Let's see what you've got." The sparring ring was set up quickly. Soldiers gathered around, eager to watch. The Velithians stood silent, observing with their usual discipline, while the humans whispered and made bets on the outcome. Daniel rolled his shoulders and stretched his arms. "I'll go easy on you." Celara narrowed her eyes. "Do not insult me." The combat instructor signaled for them to begin. Celara moved first. She was fast, a blur of motion as she struck with precision. A quick jab to Daniel's side, followed by a sweeping kick. Most opponents would have stumbled, but Daniel dodged with ease, countering with a swift punch. Celara blocked it, twisting away, her mind racing. He's good. Daniel fought differently from Velithians. He was unpredictable, always adjusting, never following a set pattern. It frustrated her. Velithian combat was disciplined and controlled, but Daniel fought like a storm, wild, fluid, unstoppable. She tried to keep up, but his movements were too smooth, too natural. Then, a mistake. She hesitated for half a second, and Daniel took advantage. He stepped in, caught her wrist, and swept her legs out from under her. She hit the mat hard. A gasp rippled through the audience. Daniel knelt beside her, grinning. "Looks like I win." Celara's face burned. She had never felt humiliated like this before. But worse than that, worse than losing, was the way her heart pounded, not from anger, but from something else entirely. She shoved his hand away and stood up, forcing herself to remain calm. Again. Daniel blinked in surprise. Then his grin returned. "All right, princess. Let's dance." They fought again, and again, and again. Each time, Celara improved, learning his movements, adjusting her own tactics. But no matter how hard she fought, she could not defeat him. Daniel was stronger, faster, and most annoyingly, he enjoyed this far too much. After the 5th round, they stood across from each other, panting. The officer obeyed, and Celara stepped forward. Her voice was cold and sharp. "This is Celara. State your purpose." A deep voice answered. "You belong to the Empire. You ran from your duty. Surrender now, and no harm will come to your people." Daniel scoffed. "Lies. They'll kill everyone here if they get the chance." Celara knew he was right. Her enemies didn't believe in mercy. She lifted her chin. "If I refuse." The voice darkened. "Then we destroy this station." Celara's fingers curled at her sides. They were forcing her into a choice: surrender herself or let innocent people die. But she wasn't that weak princess they thought she was. She turned to Daniel. "Are the defense systems fully charged?" He nodded. "Ready when you are." Celara's eyes flicked to the crew. "Prepare for battle. Lock onto their weak points." The soldiers hesitated. "But princess." She cut them off. "I am no longer a princess. I am a warrior. And we will not kneel." Daniel smirked. "Now that's the Celara I know." The enemy sent another warning. "Last chance. Surrender or die." Celara's lips curled into a cold smile. "You first." She gave the order. "Fire." The station's cannons roared to life. Bright energy blasts shot through space, striking the enemy ship. The battle had begun. The enemy fired back, shaking the station with violent tremors. Celara gripped the control panel, watching as Daniel coordinated the counterattack. "Target their engines," he ordered. Explosions flashed across the enemy ship. They weren't expecting resistance. "They're retreating." An officer shouted. Celara narrowed her eyes. "No, they're repositioning. Stay alert." The enemy ship suddenly turned, charging its main cannon. Daniel cursed. "They're going all in." Lara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the communicator. All units, fire everything we have. Now. A storm of energy blasts struck the enemy ship. The final shot hit its core. A massive explosion erupted in space, and the enemy vessel shattered into debris. The battle was over. Cheers erupted in the command center, but Lara remained still. It wasn't just a victory. It was a message. Her enemies would know that she would never run again. As the crew celebrated, Daniel walked up to her. "That was impressive," he said with a grin. "But you're bleeding." Lara glanced down. A small cut on her arm. She had barely noticed it. "I have suffered worse." Daniel smirked. "Yeah, but you don't have to suffer alone." She looked at him, really looked at him. He had fought by her side without hesitation. Not because of duty, not because of orders, but because he believed in her. And for the first time she realized she didn't want to fight alone anymore. Lara exhaled. "Thank you, Daniel." His expression softened. "Anytime, princess." She didn't correct him. For the first time, she didn't mind the title. Because now, she wasn't just a princess. She was a warrior, a leader, and maybe, just maybe, she had finally found something worth fighting for. The end. He grinned. "I never thought you were." His words made something stir inside her. She wasn't sure why. That evening, Lara found herself alone again, staring at the stars. She had spent her whole life believing emotions were a distraction, a weakness, and yet, since meeting Daniel, she had begun to feel things she didn't understand. She hated it, and yet, she didn't. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Daniel." "You're thinking too much," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. She exhaled. "I do not like things I do not understand." He smiled. "Welcome to being alive." She gave him a sharp look. "You humans are strange. And you're starting to sound like one of us." Lara stiffened. "That is not funny." Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. You've got the stubbornness down, the pride, the constant overthinking." She narrowed her eyes. "Careful, human." He smirked. "See, even the threats sound human." She shook her head, unable to stop a small smile from forming. He was impossible. They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. Then, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Lara, what do you want?" She turned to him, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I mean, beyond war, beyond being a warrior. What do you want?" The question caught her off guard. She had never thought about it before. What did she want? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, because for the first time in her life, she didn't know the answer. Lara stood in the training hall, her muscles tense as she focused on the man before her. Daniel had become her greatest challenge, not just in combat, but in ways she didn't fully understand. For weeks, she had sparred with him, each session pushing her limits. She had studied his movements, learned his techniques, adapted her own style. Yet, every time, he still won. Not today. She took a deep breath, rolling her shoulders. Across from her, Daniel smirked. "You look serious today, princess." She ignored his teasing. "Begin." Lara moved first, her speed sharper than before. She struck low, aiming for his legs, but Daniel stepped back just in time. He countered with a quick jab. She dodged. A swift kick. She blocked. She could feel it. This time was different. She wasn't just reacting. She was predicting his moves, forcing him to adjust. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're getting better." Lara didn't answer. She lunged forward, her fist aiming for his ribs. He blocked, but she was ready. She twisted, using her momentum to bring her knee up. He barely dodged. For the first time, she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. She was winning. The thought sent a rush of energy through her veins. She attacked again, faster, stronger. She forced Daniel to step back, his defense breaking little by little. And then she saw an opening. Without thinking, she lunged. Her hands grabbed his arm, twisting him off balance. She used his own momentum against him, sweeping his legs. He fell. But before she could fully celebrate her victory, he grabbed her wrist. With a sudden pull, she fell with him. The impact wasn't hard, but Silera felt the air leave her lungs as she landed, on top of Daniel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her hands were braced against his chest, his arms trapped beneath her. His body was warm, solid beneath her own. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath, see the way his eyes studied her, calm, unreadable. Her heart pounded. Something about this was wrong, not because it was a fight, but because it wasn't. Daniel smirked. Well, this is new. Silera quickly moved away, standing up faster than she should have. You were careless. Daniel sat up, rubbing his neck. I underestimated you. His eyes held something unreadable. That won't happen again. She crossed her arms. Good. I do not need your mercy. He chuckled, shaking his head. That's what I like about you, princess. You never stop pushing forward. Silera turned away, her chest feeling tight. Why did his words affect her like this? Later that night, Silera stood on the balcony of the ship, staring at the stars. The battle in her mind was worse than the one she fought earlier. She had trained her whole life to control herself, to be a warrior, to suppress weakness. But Daniel, he made her feel things she didn't understand. She had always believed emotions were a distraction. Yet now she was distracted by the one person who challenged her more than anyone else. A presence behind her made her tense. She didn't turn. She knew who it was. Daniel leaned against the railing beside her. You're thinking too much again. Silera exhaled. I do not like things I do not understand. Daniel smirked. That's what makes life interesting. She glanced at him. You humans are strange. And yet, you're spending more and more time around one. She narrowed her eyes. Do not assume things, human. He laughed softly. I don't assume. I observe. She looked back at the stars, her thoughts spinning. Then, Daniel's voice became quieter. What do you want, Silera? The question caught her off guard. She frowned. What do you mean? I mean, beyond war. Beyond fighting. What do you want? The question made her chest tighten. She had spent her whole life knowing her duty, knowing what was expected of her. But now, she didn't know the answer. And that terrified her. Silera had always believed she understood herself. She was a warrior, a princess, a leader of her people. Duty above all else. But now, standing beside Daniel, his question echoed in her mind. What do you want? It was such a simple thing to ask, yet she had no answer. She had never thought beyond war, beyond responsibility, beyond what was expected of her. And now, for the first time, she felt uncertain. The next morning, Silera trained alone. She struck the practice dummy with precision, each movement sharp, controlled. But something was wrong. Her focus was missing. Her movements were fast, but her mind was slow. The question wouldn't leave her. What do you want? She clenched her fists, frustrated. Why did Daniel's words affect her so much? Just then, she heard footsteps. She turned sharply, expecting an opponent. Instead, it was Daniel. Thought I'd find you here, he said with a small smile. She exhaled and turned back to the dummy. I am training. I can see that, he said, leaning against the wall. But you're distracted. She stiffened. I am not. He raised an eyebrow. Then why did you just miss your strike? Silara's eyes narrowed. She hadn't missed. Had she? Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned. Not bad, princess. You're tougher than you look. Silara swallowed the frustration rising in her chest. I will defeat you eventually. Daniel chuckled. I'll be waiting. She turned and walked away, but she could feel his eyes on her. And for reasons she couldn't explain, it made her skin tingle. Something was happening to her, and she didn't know how to stop it. Scylla stood in the dimly lit training hall long after the sparring session had ended. The humans had left, laughing and talking, their voices fading down the corridors. The Velithian warriors had departed in silence, their disciplined nature preventing them from expressing the disappointment she knew they felt. She had lost, repeatedly. Her pride burned at the memory. But more than that, something deep inside her was unsettled. Every time Daniel Carter had smiled at her, every time he had dodged her attacks effortlessly, something strange stirred within her. She tightened her fists. This is weakness. And yet she wanted to understand why she felt this way. The next morning, Scylla entered the human side of the base with purpose. Velithians were given their own separate quarters, but she walked past them, heading toward the human common area. A few soldiers stopped to stare, surprised to see her in their territory, but none dared to question her presence. She found Daniel in the cafeteria, sitting with a group of his men. He had a relaxed posture, a grin on his face as he listened to their stories. His casual nature, the way he seemed at ease with everything, frustrated her. But when his sharp blue eyes met hers, something inside her stumbled. For a moment, she forgot what she had come here to do. Then, regaining control, she approached. "I need to speak with you." Daniel raised an eyebrow, setting down his drink. "Well, good morning to you too, Princess." The soldiers around him chuckled, but one glance from Scylla silenced them. Daniel smirked, then stood up, nodding for her to follow. They walked to an empty corridor. "So," Daniel said, leaning casually against the wall, "what's on your mind?" Scylla took a slow breath. "I wish to train under you." Daniel blinked. "Come again." "You are skilled," she said, her voice firm. "You fight differently than my people. I must understand your techniques. I must become stronger." Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. "And you're willing to let a human teach you?" Scylla hesitated. Velithians were proud warriors. Learning from another species, especially humans, was unheard of. But she pushed her pride aside. "Yes." Daniel grinned. "All right, Princess, but I don't train people who can't take a joke." Scylla narrowed her eyes. "I do not see how humor is relevant to combat." Daniel chuckled. "Oh, this is gonna be fun." Training began at dawn. Scylla arrived early, but Daniel was already there, stretching. She watched him, studying the way his muscles moved. There was a relaxed strength to him, a confidence that made it seem as if nothing could shake him. He turned and caught her staring. "Like what you see." She stiffened. "I am observing your technique." He smirked. "Sure you are." Ignoring him, she took a stance. "What are we training today?" Daniel crossed his arms. "You're fast, but you rely too much on predictable movements. You fight with strategy, but not with instinct. That's what I'm gonna fix." Scylla frowned. Instinct leads to reckless decisions. Her body was sore, but her mind was restless. She had trained all her life to be the best warrior of her people. And yet, a human had forced her to question everything she knew. She stopped by one of the large observation windows, staring out into the stars. "Can't sleep." She turned sharply. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. He wasn't wearing his combat gear, just a simple shirt and pants. He looked different, more human. She sighed. "My mind is troubled." Daniel leaned against the window. "Wanna talk about it?" Scylla hesitated. Why was she even considering it? Finally, she spoke. "I do not understand you, Daniel Carter." He raised an eyebrow. "Me specifically, or humans in general?" "Both," she admitted. "Your kind is unpredictable. You fight with skill, but you also fight with emotion. You laugh in the face of danger. And you make me question things I should not question." Daniel studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You know, Scylla, strength isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about letting yourself feel. She stiffened. That is not the way of my people. Maybe not, he said, but you're not just any warrior. You're different. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Silara looked away. His words made something stir inside her again. This human, he was dangerous in a way no enemy had ever been. And yet she couldn't walk away. Tomorrow, she said, we train again. Daniel grinned. Looking forward to it, princess. As she left, her heart was beating faster than it should have been. Silara stood in the training hall, her fists clenched as she controlled her breathing. She had sparred with Daniel many times now, and with each session, something inside her grew stronger. Not just her skills, but something deeper. She didn't know what it was. She only knew that when she was around him, she had to fight harder than ever, not just to keep up, but to keep herself from losing control. Daniel stood across from her, rolling his shoulders. You ready, princess? She gave a sharp nod. Always. The fight began without hesitation. Silara moved fast, her strikes sharper and more precise than before. Daniel blocked and countered, but this time, she was keeping up. A punch aimed at his ribs. He dodged. A kick toward his legs. He caught her ankle, but she twisted and broke free. She could see the momentary surprise in his eyes. She was faster. For the first time, Silara wasn't just following his lead. She was making him work to keep up. She lunged, her fist flying toward his chest. But in the last second, he sidestepped, grabbed her arm, and twisted. She fell. But before she hit the ground, she reacted. Her instincts took over. She rolled, using the momentum to flip herself upright. Without thinking, she lunged again. This time, she tackled him. They hit the floor together. For a moment, neither of them moved. Silara found herself on top of him, her hands gripping his shoulders. Daniel was beneath her, breathing hard, his face close, too close. She could feel his warmth, the rise and fall of his chest. A strange silence filled the air. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Then, Daniel chuckled. That was new. She quickly moved away, standing up. I caught you off guard. He sat up, rubbing his neck. Yeah, you did. His eyes met hers. You're improving fast, Silara. She crossed her arms. I told you. I am no weakling.